today in America, what does a Christian properly involved in government look like?
I'm just going to say the same thing I said, the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay,
love your neighbor as yourself. Take others before your own needs. Feed the poor, clothe the sick, care for the widow, advocate for these values.
I agree with all that. And so, for example, to care for the poor and care for the vulnerable, abolish abortion. Right?
So abortion is another issue, but what about the living right now? Because you don't seem to be for raising taxes on billionaires.
Of course not. Why would I?
So if you want to legislate morality, abortion, I want to curb the sin of greed.
But so you want to curb the sin of greed by taking other people's stuff? That's pretty greedy of you.
No, it is not.
What's up, beautiful people of YouTube? Hope you guys are feeling good. My name is Elario, your host as always, and today I'm back with another video from Charlie Kirk that I want to check out with you guys. This is called, Can You Be a Christian and a Nationalist? Let's see who asked this and why. You know the drill, guys. We talk less and we react more. Let's check this one out.
Hello, how are you?
Good. My name is Nick. I'm an aerospace engineering student here. Got a couple questions.
Awesome.
That's all right. So I'm particularly concerned about your brand of Christianity. As a Christian myself, Christian nationalism I do not agree with at all. I think it's antithetical to the values of the early church. And I think, how do you reconcile especially white Christians in this America marrying politics and power with their faith in this country?
There's a lot there. I've never described myself as a Christian nationalist. So I'm a Christian and a nationalist, so I've never used those two things.
And then right there, that and nationalist, where in the scriptures does a Christian...
Well, thank you. Jeremiah 29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in, because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare. Let me continue. Daniel fasted and prayed for his nation. Esther and Mordecai cared for their nation. They were counsel to the king.
Right.
Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Joseph, Jacob. I could keep on going. Moses, Aaron. In fact, Moses was so political that he wrote an entire book of the Torah all about how to set up a government. It's the book of Deuteronomy. So, in fact, the Bible is an explicitly political text amongst many other things.
Now, can we interpret those texts in the light of the revelation of Christ? Because you just cited all Old Testament texts, but you have not once cited St. Paul.
Okay, yeah. If you want me to also, by the way, just so we are
cite St. Paul about the kingdom of heaven and the governance.
Just so we're clear, do you think that the New Testament is greater than the Old Testament?
It is. It is greater because the revelation of Christ dictates how we interpret the Old Testament.
So you think that all of a sudden, like Genesis 1 is not as great just because of the New Testament?
The Old Testament was a type and shadow of the things to come, and now we live in the full revelation of Christ.
Again, that
is by definition
that is such
lesser.
A dangerous theological...
That's not true. That's Christological theology.
Hold on. Of course I believe in the resurrection. But to all of a sudden say that, like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is, like, somehow lesser because of the revelation of the New Testament. Christ even said, I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets, I came to fulfill the law. In fact, he said all the laws of the prophet hang on the two teachings, Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 3 through 5. However, to use a New Testament example, as you asked, says in 1 Timothy, pray for your leaders in authority by name that they might make righteous great decisions. I'm going to continue. Christ our Lord said, on this rock build my what?
Church.
Wrong. Ecclesia. It's not the word church.
Okay,
the word
English
church,
translations of Common Bible say church, so my bad.
Well, actually, it shouldn't, because the original Greek term says, on this rock build my government structure. Ecclesia was a secular word used in that time, which was all about the advancement of freedom and liberty, which are the two words in Greek, eleutheria and isonomia, which are the two words there. So the point being, Christ called us to be salt and light. We as Christians should change the environment that we come in contact with. That's what salt and light do. So why should we then not care about changing government to be more Christ-like?
Well, you're conflating changing government to be more Christ-like with what I was discussing was nationalistic endeavors, which is the inherent view that our nation is better than other nations.
Well, it is.
Well, God shows no partiality. So
well, no, that's not true. God says in Revelation, I will judge the nations. God says that
the nations means ethnicity groups. It does not mean borders of countries established.
Not necessarily. Hold on.
It does.
God says the constitution of Israel will come at the end of the age. Borders is biblical. The entire book of Nehemiah is about building a wall around the nation of Israel. In fact, the idea of borders, the idea of sovereignty is an explicitly biblical idea.
Yes, but Israel is no longer defined by the physical borders. It's actually defined in the spiritual sons and daughters of God who believe in Jesus.
That's a Catholic interpretation.
That's not just Catholic.
Again, it's primarily a Catholic interpretation. I don't share it. I don't want to get into that theological debate.
Okay.
Because we're going to get nowhere. My mind won't be changed. Your mind won't be changed. But around nationalism, why don't you tell me, and I will listen, what a Christian's role in government should or should not be?
Simple. Sermon on the Mount. Operate in that way, and that's.
What does that look like in practice in America in 2025?
Well, in practice, it doesn't look like what has happened in history with Christians who have tried to establish their governance in the lands. For example, American history, slavery. Majority of white Christians supported the institution of slavery. Move on to Jim Crow.
That's actually not true.
No,
Time
that is
out.
true. That is true.
Time out. 9 out of 13 of the states, by the time of the ratification of the Constitution, were already abolishing slavery. 9 out of 13.
Let's move on to Jim Crow.
Time out. Slavery actually had a minority approval rating by the time of the U.S. founding. We were the second nation ever to abolish slavery because of Christianity. So let me just ask a very moral question. The Christians that got involved in the abolition of slavery, like John Quincy Adams and William Wilberforce, they did it in the name of Christ. Were they wrong?
No, but those were small minority Christians. Majority of the Christians of the time.
Movements.
Let's move on to Jim Crow because majority.
You're moving on
No, because I didn't finish my statement.
But it was
You interrupted my
Christianity that
statement.
abolished slavery.
It was a sect in Christianity that abolished it. It was a remnant of Christians who didn't go with the established order of what Christians believed.
Well, no.
We can go to Jim Crow. Let me finish the statement, please.
Okay. I mean,
in Jim Crow, majority of white Christians also supported not abolishing Jim Crow and keeping the institution. They did not support the civil rights movement. This is documented data.
Well, not supporting the Civil Rights Act and supporting Jim Crow are two completely different things.
Those go hand in hand
Well,
together.
the Civil Rights Act was a disaster. I mean, that was a terrible idea. But, I mean, that's a whole separate issue. But just so we are clear, because the Civil Rights Act hyper-racialized America. We actually talk about race more after the Civil Rights Act than before. We were promised a color-bride society. We got a race-obsessed society. But just to be clear, today in America, what does a Christian properly involved in government look like?
I'm just going to say the same thing I said, the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay,
love your neighbor as yourself. Take others before your own needs. Feed the poor, clothe the sick, care for the widow, advocate for these values.
I agree with all that. And so, for example, to care for the poor and care for the vulnerable, abolish abortion. Right?
So abortion is another issue, but what about the living right now? Because you don't seem to be for raising taxes on billionaires.
Of course not. Why would I?
So if you want to legislate morality, abortion, I want to curb the sin of greed.
But so you want to curb the sin of greed
So
by taking other people's stuff? That's pretty greedy of you.
No, it is not.
Just to be clear,
the data shows is that
raising
the
taxes,
past 40 years, the wealth in this country, the wealth inequality
Yes.
has increased, which is the top 1% has
Yes.
grabbed the wealth of the majority bottom.
There are reasons why that's happened, but just
Why
so
is
we
that
are
happening?
clear,
Why is that happening?
I'm happy to explain that. Just so we are clear, saying we're going to just raise tax on the billionaires, that statement, you just violated 2 out of the 10 commandments.
That's not true.
Thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet. We're going to go take other people's money.
How is that stealing?
Because it's their money.
We live in a society that is run by taxes. How is that stealing?
Well, taxations are a form of theft, definitionally, because it's not the government's money. It is private property that you earn when the government extracts it by
someone breaks
force.
into your house, you call the police. When you have a fire, you call the fireman. When you want to drive, you drive on roads. When you want to mail, you use the U.S. Post Office. These are all taxes.
Yeah,
we all contribute as a society.
Of course. But
this is elementary stuff. It's not theft. How do you run a society
hold
without
on.
taxes?
What happens if you don't pay your taxes?
I mean, you get the law handed to you, but
Oh, okay. So therefore, so you pay taxes at gunpoint.
if you break the law, you should pay the fine.
No, exactly. That's the point. Is that taxes are not voluntary. Nor do I think they should be voluntary. You just have to be honest and say, yes, at some form, the government has to forcibly take some of your money away. I agree with that. But just we're going in so many different rabbit trails. Let me ask you just like a fundamental, simple question. Is that, do you want to see a government that fights for Christian principles or not?
That excludes the rest of the population. If we're not living in a theocracy, no, I want equal representation. And the church doesn't need to have government in order to thrive. In fact, in suffering and humility, the church thrives.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's like totally insane, but that's fine.
How is that insane? Go look at the early church.
You want to invite persecution is what you're saying.
I'm not inviting it, but
Yes,
Christians ought to welcome it and embrace it and go through it.
Okay, but sometimes persecution results in the unjust suffering of millions of people unnecessarily. And so you should never invite evil into this world.
Did Jesus not promise that to us?
Well, did Jesus promised trials and difficult times?
Yes.
Yes, of course, but we should not invite it voluntarily. You know what that's like saying? Let's just, have no military. Everyone can invite us because persecution will make us stronger. It's such a ridiculous, like, abstract argument.
I mean, I don't see any scripture supporting a military for Christians.
You don't think we should have a military?
A government can have a military, but Christians...
Yeah, I mean, look, man, you got to go a lot deeper into the scriptures. You have a dangerously surface level.
You should read early church fathers on how they view violence and the
Actually,
military.
so you want to talk about early church fathers? Tell me about St. Augustine's just war theory.
You tell me about
Tell
it.
me, you just brought up early church fathers.
No, you tell me about
Tell
it.
me about St. Augustine in the City of God, 3rd chapter, just war theory.
Well, I don't really agree with a lot of St. Augustine because
He's the most popular early church
West,
father.
in the West. But there's the East, St. Athanasius, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, all these different names that you probably are not familiar because it's in the East. But most early church fathers condemned violence for, if you're in the church, you must leave the military, quit service because you now belong to the kingdom of God, which operates on a different
Do you agree
plane.
with that?
I agree that if you're a Christian, you have no reason to commit violence for any reason at all.
I think that's insane. Honestly.
Just look at the example of Jesus. Was he put on a throne or did he embrace the cross?
It says at the end of age, Jesus will come with a sword to judge.
Are you reading Revelation literally?
Yes, of course
So
I am.
he has an actual sword out of his mouth.
Yeah, I mean, like, what's your
The
contention?
interpretation that's common is Revelation, when he has a sword, that's the word dividing your soul and spirit, piercing the hearts. He's not waging war on people and killing millions of people.
That Christians should not serve in the military is your contention?
That's my belief. You don't have to believe that.
Yeah. We're going to have to get to the next question.
All right.
That's a new one. I got to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. This is a rather tricky one. A very, very tricky one. I mean, in the Bible, we see examples of leaders, people who God favored. Since the Old Testament was based on the people of Israel, the Jews, these people were in positions of authority. Joseph, King David, King Solomon, Moses. I mean, Deuteronomy is a book of laws. I honestly don't reconcile the notion that as a Christian you should absolve yourself from the things of the nation. I honestly don't agree with that, because even in the book of Romans, the Bible will tell you that when you're with the Romans, you behave like the Romans. And if your behavioral pattern should depend on the place where you are, and I'm going to use the word pagans here, and pagans are the ones dictating how you should live, then you see that you'll have a problem. Because in all practical sense, it is highly impossible for anyone whatsoever to dissolve or absolve themselves from anything in society. If we should actually follow his viewpoints, then going to school should not be an option because you're a Christian. Then receiving health care should not be an option because you're a Christian. As he said, serving in the military should not be an option because you're a Christian. Paying taxes too should not be an option because you're a Christian. These are all things of the world. And yet, he's supporting tax for the rich. And we can see that even in the New Testament, all tax collectors were viewed as thieves. So if in the world today, the tax are being used for something other than what they were being used for then, maybe for the betterment of society, then why should you be allowed to receive such benefit if you, under the guise of being a Christian, don't want to contribute to those things? I just can't understand it. And I'm with Charlie 100% on this one, because if you want society to be better for you, if you want society to have the Christian values, to have the godly principles, then you should go into try and get into the position of power. Try and get into a position where you can make those laws so they can reflect on everyone. Everyone is citing the Jim Crow era as an example. I'm going to tell you this. The reason why slavery became systemic was because a single man, Jim Crow, believed that the blacks were lesser beings. And by the time he got into power, he enacted that particular notion with such force that the world felt it. Now, as Charlie said, we Christians were the salt of the earth and light of the world. If we are to make impact, if we are to make people see that, okay, yes, we are the light, we spread the truth, the gospel we believe in, our beliefs, our principles, those are the truth. Would you achieve that by withdrawing and keeping to yourself? Because if we're going to stand on this student's logic, then he shouldn't even be here. Because he's absolving himself from everything that has to do with the world. And as a matter of fact, if he's to follow his own principles, then even him coming to debates with Charlie Kirk shouldn't be happening. It's obnoxious, really. I can't reconcile being a Christian and not getting involved in things that are for the betterment of your nation. Requoting what Charlie Kirk said. In the Bible verse he quoted, Jeremiah, you can see that at different instances, even when the student asked him to state something in the New Testament, you can see that at different times there are examples and citations that will tell you that as a Christian, the nation's interest should be at your heart. You should have the nation's interest at heart. And his theory of the New Testament and the Old Testament. Look, without the Old Testament, there would have been no New Testament. That's just the truth. The Old Testament starts right from the creation story. It starts right from the time God created the world. And for you to suddenly feel like it means nothing, everything in the Old Testament means nothing, because of the promises and the goodwill that God himself gave us through his son, Jesus Christ, then there's a problem somewhere. Honestly, there is a problem somewhere. Because as Charlie quoted, even in the Bible, you see that Christ said he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Christ did not come to stamp down everything that has been happening in the times of old. Yes, there are particular examples of when Apostle Peter saw a white sheet of unclean animals 3 times. And when he said it was unclean, the angel of the Lord told him to eat. And he said, no, he won't eat because it's unclean. And at the 3rd time, the angel told him, do not call that which I have made unclean. This was a contrast between the Gentile he was going to see and the Jews. Because the Jews then had no dealings whatsoever with the Gentiles. And this particular official who he was going to see was a Gentile. But he wanted desperately to become a Christian. The New Testament, after Christ's death, talks about Christianity. Now, apart from such citations, which even through the grace of God made the good news of the gospel spread to other nations, what other change does one actually see from the Old Testament that isn't in the New Testament? Most of the laws are reapplied. The second change I can maybe cite is when Christ said the sins of the father will no longer be visited upon the son, but every man shall account for his own actions. You can say, yes, there were a few changes, but it does not it does not neutralize the potency of the Old Testament. It does not damn the fact that there are laws there. Literally, the book of Proverbs is a guidebook for every human soul. It teaches you things on how to live. So, to answer the question of this, that's the topic of this video, can you be a Christian and a nationalist? I believe so. I 100% believe so. Because it's only when you are in a position of authority, it's only when you stand to serve the nation, it's only then that you can actually spread your Christian values. And I'm not talking about coercing people to believe in what you believe. No. I'm saying through that notion, through bringing yourself out for the world to see, for people to look at and think that you're worth emulating, for people to say, okay, yes, your livelihood, it's in the right path. They want to emulate. You can only achieve this by coming out, by entering the nation. You won't achieve that by ostracizing yourself under the blanket or the guise of being a Christian. Ostracization has never been part of Christianity, and it will never be. That's just the honest truth. Anyway, guys, tell us what you think about this video in the comment section, and please do us leave a thumbs up for us at the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe.